The city was unusually quiet that night. Officer James leaned back in his patrol car, his tired eyes scanning the empty street ahead. The glow of neon signs flickered in the distance, their reflections shimmering on the rain-soaked pavement. He took a slow sip of his now lukewarm coffee, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle in. It had been a long shift. Too many calls, too many reports, and not enough time to breathe. But even in the stillness of the night, he remained alert. The radio crackled, filling the silence with brief bursts of static. Nothing urgent, just routine updates. He sighed and adjusted his grip on the cup, trying to shake off the fatigue. Just then, movement in the corner of his eye caught his attention. A shadow darted across the street, a small figure low to the ground, moving hesitantly through the rain. His heart skipped a beat. It was a dog, stray by the looks of it. Its fur was damp, clinging to its thin frame, and its head hung low as it trotted toward the patrol car. James sat up, his interest piqued. Strays weren't uncommon, but something about this one felt different. As the dog drew closer, James felt his breath hitch. His grip tightened on the coffee cup, his pulse quickening. Because this wasn't just any stray, the dog stood motionless in the middle of the road, its golden fur matted with dirt and rain. Its ribs were faintly visible beneath the thin coat, a silent testament to the hunger and struggle it had endured. Officer James felt his chest tighten. Those eyes, deep, sorrowful, and filled with something he couldn't quite name, bore into him. They were familiar, hauntingly familiar. For a moment, neither of them moved. The streetlight above cast a faint glow over the animal, highlighting its fragile frame against the darkened cityscape. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the steady patter of rain against the windshield. James slowly set down his coffee. His fingers hovered over the door handle, hesitation gripping him. Was he imagining it? Was exhaustion playing tricks on him? But then the dog took a single step forward. And in that moment, James knew. This wasn't just another stray. James took a slow step forward, his polished boots clicking softly against the damp pavement. His uniform, slightly wrinkled from the long shift, rustled as he moved. The badge on his chest caught the glow of the streetlight, reflecting a faint shimmer. He extended a hand, palm up, fingers relaxed, not wanting to startle the animal. His voice, low and gentle, carried through the quiet night. "Hey there, buddy. You lost." The dog remained still, its deep brown eyes locked onto his. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. Just the officer and the stray, standing in the middle of the empty road. James could see the dog's chest rise and fall, each breath slow and steady. Its golden fur, though tangled and dirty, reminded him of something or someone. A memory, buried deep, stirred within him. Then, cautiously, the dog took a hesitant step forward. James' heart pounded. There was something about this dog, something eerily familiar. But before he could dwell on it, the dog took another step. And then another. And that's when James saw it. A glint of metal, barely visible beneath the thick, matted fur. Collar, and hanging from it a tag. James squinted, stepping closer. He reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and gently brushed the fur aside. His breath caught in his throat. The name engraved on the tag sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't just any stray. James' fingers trembled as he held the small, weathered tag between his thumb and forefinger. The cold metal felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of 100 memories. His eyes darted back to the dog's face, those deep brown eyes, filled with something that made his chest tighten. Recognition, longing, dream. "It can't be," James whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. The dog blinked slowly, as if understanding his words. Its ears twitched, and for a moment, the entire world went silent. James swallowed hard. His mind fought against the impossible, but his heart knew better. This was Duke, the same Duke he had lost years ago, the same Duke he had cried for and searched for more. Yet here he was, worn, battered, and changed by time, but alive. James felt his legs grow weak, his grip tightening around the tag as emotions surged through him. That James' mind reeled as the cold night air wrapped around him. But suddenly, the world around him faded. Flashback. The sun shone brightly over a lush green park. Laughter echoed in the air as a young James knelt on the grass. His uniform absent, replaced by a casual t-shirt and jeans. A golden-furred puppy, full of life, bounded toward him, its tiny tail wagging furiously. "Dude, come here, boy," James called, grinning. The puppy leaped into his arms, licking his face as James laughed, holding him close. They played fetch, rolling on the ground, completely lost in their own world. James remembered the feel of Duke's warm fur, the way his tiny paws would press against his chest whenever he wanted attention. The unbreakable bond between them had been something special, something irreplaceable. Then, as if the memory were slipping through his fingers like sound, the warmth faded, the golden sunlight dimmed. Present, James' breath hitched as he blinked back into reality. The cold, damp street was nothing like the warmth of that summer day. The dog before him, worn, hungry, and broken, was nothing like the lively puppy in his memories. And yet those eyes, it was him. James took a shaky step forward. His voice barely above a whisper, James' hands shook as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the matted fur of the stray. The dog flinched slightly but didn't run. It was as if he, too, felt something familiar in this moment. Slowly, James pushed the tangled fur aside, revealing a rusted heart-shaped dog tag dangling from a worn-out collar. His breath caught in his throat. His fingers traced the rough, scratched surface of the tag, and as the dim glow of the streetlight illuminated the engraving, his heart pounded. "Buddy!" James' world seemed to tilt. His chest tightened. His mind screamed that it wasn't possible, but the name on the tag said otherwise. This wasn't Duke. This was Buddy. James' throat tightened. Duke had been his childhood companion, but Buddy had been his father's dog. The dog that had gone missing the night his father never came home. A lump formed in his throat as he looked into Buddy's eyes. Deep, knowing, and filled with a lifetime of untold pain. This wasn't just a stray. James' breath hitched as he stumbled backward, his hand covering his mouth. His vision blurred with unshed tears, his mind racing to make sense of the impossible. "Buddy, is it really you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of the city. The dog tilted his head, ears twitching at the sound of his name. Then, as if confirming James' worst and greatest fear at once, Buddy took a slow step forward. James felt his knees weaken. He had spent years searching, hoping, and eventually mourning the dog he thought was gone forever. Yet here he was, worn, dirty, and tired, but alive. A sharp breath escaped James as the weight of years of guilt and longing crashed into him. His chest tightened, emotions clawing their way up from deep within. Tears welled up in his eyes, shimmering under the flickering streetlights. His fingers trembled as he reached out once more, but he didn't hesitate this time. The dog took another step, then another, before finally pressing his cold, damp nose against James' shaking hand. The moment their touch connected, the dam broke. A single tear slipped down James' cheek as a choked sob left his lips. The memory struck James like a bolt of lightning. The scene in front of him faded, replaced by a stormy night from years ago. Rain poured from the sky, drenching everything in sight. Thunder roared, shaking the ground beneath him. The wind howled through the trees, carrying away his desperate shouts. "Buddy, Buddy, come back." James ran through the muddy forest path, his uniform soaked, his flashlight flickering in the downpour. His heart pounded, fear clawing at his chest. Buddy had been terrified of thunderstorms. One sudden clap of thunder had sent him sprinting into the darkness, his small golden frame disappearing into the thick trees. James had chased after him for hours, slipping, falling, calling his name until his voice was hoarse. But there had been nothing, no barking, no rustling in the bushes, just the relentless storm, drowning out his cries. By the time morning came, His worst fear had settled in. Buddy was gone. The memory dissolved, bringing James back to the present, where the same dog, older, thinner, but unmistakably Buddy, stood right in front of him. James remained frozen for a moment, his heart hammering in his chest. Then, slowly, he extended his trembling hand. Buddy hesitated, his golden fur illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. His nose twitched as he sniffed James' fingers, his eyes filled with cautious recognition. And then, as if the years apart had never happened, Buddy took one small step closer, then another. With a quiet whimper, he licked James' hand. James let out a shaky breath, his throat tightening with emotion. His knees buckled, and he dropped down in front of Buddy, reaching out with both arms. "Oh, Buddy, it's really you," he whispered. Buddy didn't hesitate this time. He pushed his head into James' chest, his tail wagging weakly, as if he too couldn't believe this was real. James wrapped his arms around his lost friend, holding him tightly. He could feel Buddy's ribs beneath his scruffy fur, a painful reminder of the hardships he must have faced. Tears streamed down James' face as he buried his head into Buddy's neck. "I looked for you. I never stopped looking." Buddy let out a soft whine, his body relaxing in James' embrace. James carefully lifted Buddy into his arms, feeling how frail the dog had become. Yet, despite the weight of time and hardship, there was still warmth, still life in his old friend's body. He gently placed Buddy in the passenger seat of his patrol car, wrapping him in a soft blanket he kept in back. Buddy curled up, his tired eyes watching James with quiet trust. For the first time in what felt like forever, James smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. He reached out, running a hand over Buddy's scruffy fur. "Let's go home, Buddy," he whispered. Buddy let out a small, content sigh as James started the engine. As the patrol car pulled away, its headlights cut through the dark, disappearing into the glowing city skyline. Tonight, James wasn't just